You stand in the dim light of a thousand-year-old library, your fingers tracing a symbol that should not exist, a simple geometric shape that somehow contains the entire philosophy of life and death. And you wonder how J.K. Rowling managed to hide the most profound mystery of the Harry Potter universe in plain sight for nearly a decade before readers fully understood what they were looking at. The Deathly Hallows symbol appears innocent enough at first glance, a triangle containing a circle with a vertical line running through both. But this elegant design carries the weight of centuries of alchemical tradition, medieval woodcut artistry, and the eternal human obsession with conquering mortality itself. You see this mark stamped on the cover of The Tales of Beedle the Bard, scratched into the stone wall of a magical pub, worn as a pendant by Luna Lovegood's father, and you realize that Rowling embedded this symbol into her narrative with the precision of a medieval illuminator hiding secret messages in manuscript margins. The historical parallel is striking because in 1456, Johannes Gutenberg completed his famous Bible, revolutionizing how stories could be preserved and shared. And just as those printed pages carried Christian symbolism that illiterate peasants could recognize, Rowling's symbol functions as a visual shorthand for an entire belief system within her fictional world. But here is where things get genuinely fascinating, because the Deathly Hallows symbol is not just a made-up sigil, it draws from authentic traditions of alchemical and Masonic imagery, where triangles represented the elements or the Trinity, circles symbolized eternity or the Philosopher's Stone, and vertical lines suggested the path of enlightenment or the axis mundi connecting heaven and earth. You might think this sounds like the kind of overthinking that drives English teachers to assign 5-page essays about the symbolism of a blue curtain, but Rowling herself studied classics and French at the University of Exeter, immersing herself in exactly the kind of medieval and Renaissance texts where such symbols proliferated. The triangle in the Deathly Hallows represents the Cloak of Invisibility, the circle represents the Resurrection Stone, and the line represents the Elder Wand. But on a deeper level, these three objects embody three fundamental human responses to death: hiding from it, denying it, and fighting it. Scholars of children's literature continue to debate whether Rowling intended the Hallows to be read as a critique of humanity's refusal to accept mortality or as a celebration of the magical thinking that makes life bearable. And honestly, both interpretations seem to coexist comfortably within the text, much like how medieval monks could simultaneously view death as a holy transition and an enemy to be feared. You walk through the pages of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, published in 2007, and you notice how the symbol appears gradually, almost subliminally, training your eye to recognize it before you understand its significance. The first time Harry sees it, he does not even register it as important. It is just a strange triangular eye worn by Xenophilius Lovegood at Bill and Fleur's wedding, and this narrative technique mirrors how sacred symbols actually function in religious traditions, becoming part of the cultural wallpaper before initiates learn their deeper meanings. In actual medieval Europe, common people would have seen crosses, saints' symbols, and alchemical signs everywhere without necessarily understanding the theological debates those images represented, and Rowling recreates this experience by making the Hallows symbol simultaneously obvious and invisible. Here is a detail that might surprise you. The concept of three magical objects that together grant mastery over death appears in multiple folklore traditions, from the Irish treasures of the Tuatha De Danann to the regalia of various European monarchies, which were often said to possess supernatural properties. The quirky part is that in some medieval legends, possessing all three sacred objects was actually considered dangerous or hubristic, a sign that the owner was trying to claim powers reserved for the divine, which makes you wonder if Rowling was tapping into a deeper current of cautionary tales when she made the unified Hallows both incredibly powerful and ultimately not the solution to Harry's problems. You examine the way Rowling reveals the Hallows story through The Tale of the Three Brothers, a fairy tale within a fairy tale, and you recognize this as a classic narrative technique called a frame story, used by everyone from Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales to Scheherazade in 1001 Nights. The genius lies in how the embedded tale operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a bedtime story that wizarding children hear, a moral lesson about the dangers of pride, a historical account of how the Hallows came into existence, and a template that maps directly onto the choices made by Harry, Voldemort, and Snape in the main narrative. When you think about it, Voldemort represents the second brother, seeking the resurrection stone equivalent through his Horcruxes in an attempt to cheat death. Snape represents the first brother, using his skills like the Elder Wand to fight his enemies, but ultimately being destroyed by violence. And Harry represents the third brother, who greets death as an old friend when the time comes. This tripartite structure would have been immediately recognizable to medieval audiences familiar with morality plays and allegorical literature, where characters often represented different approaches to virtue and vice. The actual history of children's literature is relevant here, because fairy tales like those collected by the Brothers Grimm in the early 19th century frequently dealt with death in ways that modern sanitized versions have edited out. Original versions of stories like Snow White and Hansel and Gretel are considerably darker and more violent than the Disney adaptations, and Rowling's Tale of the Three Brothers feels authentically old precisely because it does not shy away from mortality. You cannot help but smile at the irony that a book series often challenged by censors for promoting witchcraft actually contains one of the most sophisticated meditations on death and acceptance in contemporary children's literature, which suggests that perhaps the would-be book banners were not reading carefully enough. The Deathly Hallows symbol also functions as what semioticians call a shifter, a sign whose meaning changes depending on who is interpreting it. To believers like Xenophilius Lovegood, it represents a sacred quest for ultimate power, while to skeptics like Hermione, it is a dangerous fairy tale that distracts from practical action, and to Harry, it gradually becomes a symbol of understanding and acceptance rather than acquisition. You find yourself thinking about how symbols accumulate meaning over time, how a simple geometric shape can become laden with hope, fear, obsession, and wisdom as different characters project their desires onto it. This is not unlike how religious symbols function in the real world, where a cross or a star or a crescent carries different emotional valences for believers, skeptics, scholars, and casual observers. The debate among Harry Potter scholars about whether the Hallows are real within the fictional universe or merely symbolic manifestations of deeper truths mirrors actual theological debates about transubstantiation, the nature of miracles, and whether sacred objects possess inherent power or derive their significance from human faith. You walk deeper into the forest of symbols, and you notice that Rowling plants visual clues throughout the earlier books that only make sense in retrospect. The triangular shape of the pensive, the circular basin of memories, the wand movements that trace geometric patterns in the air. This technique of hiding information in plain sight is called prefiguration in literary studies. And Rowling employs it so thoroughly that rereading the series after knowing about the Hallows transforms the entire narrative, much like how watching The Sixth Sense a second time reveals all the clues you missed the first time around. The quirky historical detail here is that medieval manuscripts often contain marginalia, little drawings and notes in the margins that commented on or contradicted the main text. And in a sense, the Deathly Hallows symbol functions as marginalia within Rowling's own narrative, a secondary text running parallel to the main story of Harry versus Voldemort. When you consider that the symbol is literally a drawing in The Tales of Beedle the Bard, a book of illustrations that Dumbledore bequeaths to Hermione, You realize that Rowling has created her own version of an illuminated manuscript, complete with hidden meanings that require scholarly interpretation. The historical detail that in 1431 Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, partially because she claimed to hear divine voices and see visions, serves as a reminder that claims of special knowledge or access to powerful symbols have always been dangerous. Similarly, in the wizarding world, wearing the Deathly Hallows symbol during Voldemort's rise to power becomes a risky act of identification, marking the wearer as either a believer in Dumbledore's supposedly crackpot ideas or as a supporter of Grindelwald's dark legacy. You smile at the thought that literature professors are probably still arguing about whether the Hallows are more important than the Horcruxes in understanding the thematic architecture of the series, which is exactly the kind of debate that gives academics job security and makes book club meetings run 2 hours long. The symbol itself is almost frustratingly simple. A child could draw it in seconds, and yet it contains multitudes, which is perhaps the point. The most profound truths often have the simplest expressions, while the most elaborate explanations sometimes obscure more than they reveal. You stand there in your imaginary library, your fingers still tracing that triangle circle line, and you understand that you are touching not just a fictional symbol, but a meditation on storytelling itself, on how images and narratives work together to create meaning, on how the same symbol can represent hope or obsession or wisdom, depending on the heart of the beholder. And you realize that this is why people queue up at midnight for book releases and reread their favorite stories until the pages fall apart and get tattoos of symbols from fictional universes on their actual bodies. The Deathly Hallows symbol has transcended its origins as a plot device in a children's book series to become a genuine cultural sigil, recognizable to millions of people across the world. Which makes you wonder what J.K. Rowling felt when she first sketched that simple geometric shape and realized she had created something that would outlive her, something that would be drawn in notebooks and carved into tree bark and incorporated into wedding ceremonies by people who found in it a meaningful representation of life's deepest questions. And as you turn away from the library shelf, ready to explore each component of the Hallows in turn, you cannot help but think that the real magic is not in the fictional objects themselves, but in the way a well-crafted symbol can make you see your own life differently, can make you ask yourself which brother you would be, what you would do with the power to hide from death or recall the dead or conquer all enemies, and whether the wisest choice might be to greet death as an old friend when the time comes. Whenever that might be. You open The Tales of Beedle the Bard, and immediately you notice that this is not like the sanitized fairy tales you grew up with. These stories have teeth, they have consequences. They feel like they were written in an era when children were expected to handle darkness because darkness was simply part of life. The book itself, within the Harry Potter universe, is a collection of wizarding fairy tales that every magical child knows by heart, much like how non-magical children grow up with Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood. Except these tales feature hairy hearts and hopping pots and 3 brothers who meet death on a lonely road. Rowling actually published a real-world version of The Tales of Beedle the Bard in 2008, a year after Deathly Hallows, and the physical book is gorgeous, complete with Dumbledore's commentary and J.K. Rowling's own illustrations, which makes you realize that she created an entire piece of fictional scholarship about fictional stories, a meta-textual layer cake that would make postmodern literature professors weep with joy. The tale of the 3 brothers is the centerpiece, the story that introduces the Deathly Hallows, and it begins with 3 brothers traveling at twilight who come to a river too dangerous to cross, so they use magic to create a bridge, thereby cheating death, who usually claims travelers at that spot. This opening immediately establishes several things. The brothers are clever, they work together, they use magic to solve problems, and they have annoyed a supernatural entity who does not appreciate having his usual harvest stolen. Death appears as a character in the story, which is already fascinating because in most Western traditions, death is a force or a state rather than a person you can negotiate with, though the medieval tradition of the danse macabre did personify death as a figure who comes for everyone regardless of station. Here is where Rowling's classical education shows through, because personified death appears in Greek mythology as Thanatos, in Roman tradition as Mors, and throughout medieval art as a skeleton or shrouded figure. And by making death a character who can speak and pretend to congratulate the brothers, Rowling taps into a rich tradition of death as trickster stories. The historical fact that during the Black Death in the 14th century, which killed between 75 and 200 million people in Eurasia, European art became obsessed with death imagery, producing countless paintings, woodcuts, and morality plays featuring death as a character who dances with peasants and kings alike, helps you understand that personifying death was a way for people to process the incomprehensible scale of mortality they were witnessing. You might think it is a bit dark for a children's bedtime story, but then again, the original Little Red Riding Hood ends with the wolf eating the grandmother and the child with no woodcutter to save them. So perhaps we have simply grown soft in our expectations of what children can handle. Death pretends to be impressed with the brothers and offers each of them a prize for having been clever enough to evade him, which is your first clue that death is not being entirely honest. Anyone with even passing familiarity with fairy tales knows that when a supernatural entity offers you a gift after you have thwarted them, you should probably be suspicious. The eldest brother asks for a wand more powerful than any in existence, a wand worthy of a wizard who had conquered death, and Death obliges by fashioning the elder wand from a nearby elder tree. This detail is lovely because elder trees in European folklore were already associated with death and witchcraft. It was considered unlucky to burn elderwood or bring it into the house, and witches were supposedly fond of the tree, which means death chose the perfect material for a wand that would bring about the eldest brother's doom. The second brother, seeking to humiliate Death further, asks for the power to recall the dead, and Death picks up a stone from the riverbank and gives it the power to bring back the dead, creating the Resurrection Stone. The third brother, who is described as the humblest and wisest, does not trust Death at all and asks for something that would allow him to leave that place without Death being able to follow, so Death reluctantly hands over his own Cloak of Invisibility. You cannot help but notice that the three gifts correspond to three fundamental human desires when confronting mortality: power over others, the wand; power over death itself, the stone; and escape from danger, the cloak. And it is not coincidental that only the third desire, the most defensive and humble, leads to a long and happy life. The scholarly debate here centers on whether Death genuinely gave the brothers these items, or whether the brothers created the Hallows themselves, and the story of Death is a later mythologization. Dumbledore's commentary in the published Tales of Beedle the Bard suggests that the Peveril brothers were simply extraordinarily talented wizards who created remarkable magical objects, and the story of Death was added to explain how three mortals could make such powerful items. This is exactly how mythology works in the real world. The historical King Arthur, if he existed, was probably a Romano-British war leader, but over centuries he accumulated magical swords, wizardly advisors, quests for holy grails, and a tragic romance, all layered on by successive storytellers who found the basic historical figure insufficient to their narrative needs. You follow the eldest brother as he travels to a village, defeats a wizard he had a grudge against, takes his wand, and begins boasting about his unbeatable wand that came from death itself, which is such a spectacularly bad idea that you almost admire his commitment to making every wrong choice possible. That night, another wizard creeps into his room, steals the Elder Wand, and slits the eldest brother's throat, which is a grimly efficient way of demonstrating that possessing ultimate power makes you a target rather than untouchable. This part of the story maps directly onto the Elder Wand's bloody history in the Harry Potter series. Every owner of the wand is eventually defeated or killed by someone seeking to claim its power, creating an endless cycle of violence that only ends when someone breaks the pattern. The second brother returns home and uses the resurrection stone to bring back the girl he had loved, who died before they could marry. But she returns cold and sad, separated from him by a veil because she does not truly belong in the world of the living. This is one of the most haunting images in all of Rowling's writing, the idea that you can have someone back but not really, that the returned dead are fundamentally wrong, hollow versions of themselves, separated from the living by something more profound than physical distance. The quirky historical detail is that in Victorian England, spiritualism became wildly popular, with mediums claiming to contact the dead through seances, table rapping, and spirit photography, and many grieving people paid significant sums to these mediums hoping to communicate with lost loved ones, which suggests that the desire to reverse death is not a medieval superstition, but a very modern temptation. The second brother eventually kills himself to truly join his lost love, which death claims as his second victim, and you realize that the resurrection stone was perhaps the cruelest gift because it offers the illusion of victory over death while actually deepening despair. Meanwhile, the third brother lives to old age using the Cloak of Invisibility to hide from death, and only when he is very old does he remove the cloak, pass it to his son, and greet death as an old friend, going with him willingly and as an equal. This ending is so simple and so profound that it carries the weight of entire philosophical traditions. The brother does not defeat death or trick death or bring someone back from death. He simply lives fully and then accepts the inevitable with grace, which is about as close to wisdom as humans can manage. The historical fact that in ancient Greece, philosophers like Epicurus taught that death should not be feared because when we exist, death is not yet present, and when death is present, we do not exist, shows that Harry Potter is participating in philosophical conversations that have been ongoing for millennia. You read Hermione's response to the tale and she is immediately skeptical, dismissing it as a children's story and insisting that the Deathly Hallows cannot possibly be real, which is very Hermione. She trusts books and logic and evidence, not fairy tales and legends, even though she is literally a witch living in a magical castle. Ron is more open to the possibility, probably because he grew up hearing these stories and has that peculiar wizarding blind spot where he will believe in goblins and house elves but draw the line at, say, the resurrection stone. Harry finds himself drawn to the tale in a way he does not fully understand at first, and you realize that for someone who has spent 6 books watching people he loves die, the idea that one of those deaths might be reversible is almost unbearably tempting. The way Rowling structures this revelation is masterful. She introduces the Hallows in the 7th book when Harry is at his most desperate and vulnerable, creating maximum dramatic tension about whether he will pursue the Hallows or continue hunting Horcruxes. The scholarly debate about whether the Deathly Hallows or the Horcruxes represent the true thematic center of the 7th book continues to generate academic papers with titles like Hallows versus Horcruxes, Narrative Priority in the Potter series, which makes you smile because imagine explaining to someone from the 18th century that in the future, universities would offer courses on children's books about wizards. The tale itself is presented in the book through Hermione reading aloud from her copy of The Tales of Beedle the Bard, which Dumbledore left her in his will, along with his own handwritten annotations, and you realize that Dumbledore has been trying to teach them something even after his death, leaving breadcrumbs of wisdom in a children's storybook because he knew that direct instruction would have been ignored or misunderstood. This is very Dumbledore, who spent 7 books speaking in riddles and offering cryptic advice when a simple Voldemort made Horcruxes, here is how to destroy them, would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. But then again, If Dumbledore had been straightforward, the books would have been much shorter and considerably less interesting. You think about how the Tales of Beedle the Bard functions within the wizarding world as both entertainment and instruction, teaching children about moral choices through stories of Hairy Hearts and Babbity Rabbity and three brothers who met death, and you recognize this as exactly how fairy tales have always functioned in human societies. The Grimm brothers were not just collecting cute stories. They were preserving a folk tradition that encoded centuries of cultural wisdom, warnings, and values, even if modern readers sometimes miss the point because we have sanitized the stories beyond recognition. The quirky detail about the historical brothers Grimm is that Jacob and Wilhelm were serious academics who initially collected their fairy tales as part of a linguistic and cultural preservation project. They published Kinder- und Hausmärchen in 1812, and only later did the stories become primarily associated with children's literature, which means the tales were originally intended for a mixed-age audience that could handle complexity and darkness. You cannot help but laugh at the thought that somewhere in the Harry Potter universe, there is probably a wizarding scholar writing a dissertation on whether Beedle the Bard was a real person or a collective attribution for multiple storytellers, complete with textual analysis of whether the Fountain of Fair Fortune and The Wizard and the Hopping Pot were written by the same author based on stylistic elements, which would mirror the kinds of questions Muggle scholars ask about Shakespeare or Homer. The Tale of the Three Brothers achieves something remarkable in that it provides both the origin story for three crucial plot objects and a moral framework for understanding the choices the characters will make in the climax of the series, all in a few pages that Harry, Ron, and Hermione read by firelight in a cold tent while hiding from Death Eaters. The tale teaches that power sought for its own sake leads to destruction, that denying death leads to misery, and that accepting mortality with grace is the path to peace, which is not a bad set of lessons for a children's book or for anyone really. You hold the Cloak of Invisibility in your hands, or rather, you imagine holding it, because this particular magical object has a texture in your mind even though it exists only in fiction. It is light as air, fluid as water, and completely impenetrable to spells and sight and even death's gaze. The cloak that Harry Potter receives on his first Christmas at Hogwarts is not just any invisibility cloak. It is the Invisibility Cloak, one of 3 Deathly Hallows, passed down through the Potter family from Ignotus Peverell himself, making it roughly 7 centuries old, which in the wizarding world is ancient even by wizarding standards. You remember the moment in Philosopher's Stone, when Harry unwraps the cloak and finds the note. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well," and at the time, this seemed like a simple act of kindness from Dumbledore. But in retrospect, Dumbledore was returning a Hallow to its rightful heir while simultaneously protecting Harry, because even Voldemort cannot see through a true Cloak of Invisibility. The historical parallel here is that in medieval Europe, inheritance of precious objects, especially those with supposed magical properties, was taken very seriously. Royal regalia, saints' relics, and family heirlooms were carefully tracked through generations, and disputes over such items could spark feuds lasting decades. You might think it is convenient that Harry happens to be descended from one of the Peverell brothers, but Rowling actually planted clues about this throughout the series. The Potter family is old and wealthy. Harry's Patronus takes the same form as his father's, and there is a repeated emphasis on inheritance and lineage that culminates in the revelation that Harry carries Peverell blood. The quirky detail is that in actual medieval genealogy, nearly everyone with European ancestry can probably trace their lineage back to Charlemagne if you go back far enough, due to the way family trees expand exponentially as you move backward in time, which means that Harry being related to a wizard from the 13th century is not as statistically improbable as it might seem, though being related to the specific wizard who created a Deathly Hallow is admittedly quite the coincidence. You follow the cloak's journey through the books, and you notice that it saves Harry's life repeatedly. He uses it to sneak out of the dormitory, to visit Hagrid, to explore the castle at night, to spy on Death Eaters, and eventually to walk into the Forbidden Forest to meet Voldemort without being intercepted. The cloak represents safety and secrecy, but it also represents trust because Harry shares it with Ron and Hermione, cramming all three of them under it even when they are far too tall for that to be comfortable, creating these moments of physical closeness and shared risk that cement their friendship. The historical fact that in ancient Rome, the toga praetexta was a special toga worn by magistrates and freeborn children, and losing or damaging someone's toga could be a serious offense, reminds you that clothing with special significance has always been treated as more than mere fabric. It carries identity, status, and, in Harry's case, a legacy of wisdom passed through generations. The scholarly debate about whether the Cloak of Invisibility is more important than the other two Hallows often concludes that yes, it is, because the cloak is the only Hallow that protects its user rather than exposing them to danger, the only one that does not feed ego or obsession, the only one that multiple people can use without conflict. You think about how different Harry's story would have been without the cloak, and honestly, he probably would have been expelled from Hogwarts in first year for being caught out of bed after hours, which would have made for a very short series. The cloak also serves a symbolic function as the embodiment of humility. It is a tool for survival rather than domination, and significantly, Harry never once boasts about having it or uses it to bully others, which distinguishes him from people like Draco Malfoy, who would absolutely have used an invisibility cloak for terrible purposes. You cannot help but smile at the image of Draco with a Hallow, sneaking around hexing people and then preening about how clever he is. Though to be fair, Draco does mature somewhat by the end of the series, so maybe by book 7 he would have made better choices, or at least different ones. The relationship between the cloak and the Marauder's map is interesting, because both are tools of stealth and mischief. But the map was created by 4 talented students, while the cloak was made by Death himself, or by Ignotus Peverell. If you believe Dumbledore's more rational explanation, and the fact that the Marauder's map cannot detect someone wearing the Cloak of Invisibility suggests that the cloak operates on a different level of magic than ordinary invisibility spells or charms. You learn in Deathly Hallows that most invisibility cloaks fade over time, becoming opaque and losing their power as the enchantments decay. But the Cloak of Invisibility does not degrade because it is not enchanted in the conventional sense. It simply is invisibility, woven into its very being, which is a subtle but important distinction. This permanence matters because it means the cloak can be passed down indefinitely. James Potter gave it to Dumbledore for safekeeping. Dumbledore returned it to Harry, and presumably Harry will eventually pass it to his children, continuing a tradition that stretches back to the Middle Ages. The quirky historical detail is that in various cultures, from Japan to Scotland, there are legends of magical cloaks or capes that grant invisibility, the ability to fly, or protection from harm. And anthropologists suggest these stories reflect a universal human desire for safety and agency in a dangerous world, which is exactly what the Cloak of Invisibility provides. You watch Harry grow up with the cloak, and you notice that his relationship with it matures. In first year, it is a toy for adventures. By 5th year, it is a tool for rebellion, and by 7th year, it is a sacred trust, a link to his family and his heritage. When Harry finally understands that he is the master of death not because he sought the Hallows, but because he possessed them without being possessed by them, the cloak takes on new meaning. It represents the wisdom of Ignotus Peverell, who used his gift not to dominate or to deny death, but simply to live well until the time came to die. You think about the scene in the Forbidden Forest, where Harry walks to his death wearing the cloak, but then removes it so that Voldemort can see him, and this moment captures everything the cloak symbolizes. It protected Harry when he needed protection, but he chose courage over safety when the moment required it, which is the ultimate wisdom of the third brother. The historical fact that during World War II, the resistance movements in occupied Europe used secrecy, disguise, and stealth to survive and fight against overwhelming military power shows that the cloak's attributes are not just fantasy. They represent real strategies for survival in dangerous times. You find yourself wondering what Dumbledore felt when he held the cloak, knowing it was a Deathly Hallow, knowing he had once sought the Hallows himself with Grindelwald, and that quest had ended in his sister's death. Dumbledore asks to borrow the cloak ostensibly to study it, but you realize he was also keeping it safe, making sure it did not fall into the wrong hands, and perhaps reminding himself of his own youthful folly every time he looked at it. The fact that Dumbledore returns the cloak to Harry, rather than keeping it or destroying it or locking it away, suggests that Dumbledore had faith in Harry's character, believed that Harry would use it wisely, and perhaps hoped that Harry would break the cycle of obsession that had claimed so many previous seekers of the Hallows. You smile at the irony that the most powerful magical object in Harry's possession is one he barely thinks about most of the time. The cloak is just there, folded at the bottom of his trunk, ready when needed but not demanding attention or feeding ambition, which is probably why it is the only Hallow that never corrupts its owner. The scholarly debate about what the Cloak of Invisibility represents thematically includes interpretations ranging from the Freudian, the ego mediating between the laity and superego, to the religious, divine grace protecting the faithful, to the political, the importance of privacy and individual autonomy in the face of state surveillance. And the fact that the cloak can sustain so many readings suggests that Rowling created something genuinely resonant. You think about how many children reading Harry Potter wished they had an invisibility cloak, and you realize that the appeal is not just about mischief or spying. It is about the fantasy of being able to move through the world without being constantly observed and judged, which is a deeply human desire. In our current age of social media and surveillance capitalism, where privacy is increasingly rare and every action leaves a digital trail, the Cloak of Invisibility represents something almost extinct: the ability to simply disappear, to be unseen and unknown, to exist without performance or documentation. The cloak never stops working, never betrays its user, never demands anything in return, which makes it the most loyal companion Harry has, except perhaps for Hedwig, though Hedwig dies trying to protect him while the cloak protects him by helping him hide. Two different strategies for survival. You cannot help but think that if more people in the Harry Potter universe had access to real invisibility cloaks, the plots of the books would have been very different, probably involving a lot more invisible people bumping into each other in hallways and having awkward conversations about personal space. You see the Resurrection Stone, small and black and smooth, trapped inside the golden snitch that Dumbledore left to Harry in his will, and you understand that this tiny object contains the most dangerous temptation in the entire series: the possibility of undoing loss, of bringing back the people you love, of refusing to accept that death is final. The stone is the second Deathly Hallow, allegedly taken from the riverbank by Death himself and given to Cadmus Peverell, the second brother in the tale, and, according to legend, whoever turns it 3 times in their hand will summon shades of the dead back to the world of the living. You watch Harry struggle throughout Deathly Hallows with whether to search for the Hallows or continue destroying Horcruxes, and the most tempting Hallow is clearly the stone, because Harry has lost so many people. His parents, Sirius, Dumbledore, Hedwig, Mad-Eye Moody, Dobby, Fred, Lupin, and Tonks. The list is almost unbearable, and you understand that for Harry, the possibility of speaking to these people one more time, of apologizing or saying goodbye, or simply seeing their faces, would be worth almost any price. The historical parallel is that throughout human history, people have sought ways to communicate with or resurrect the dead, from ancient Egyptian mummification practices designed to preserve the body for the afterlife, to Victorian seances, to modern cryonics facilities where people pay to have their bodies frozen in hopes of future revival. The quirky detail is that in 1848, the Fox sisters in New York claimed to communicate with spirits through mysterious knocking sounds, sparking the spiritualist movement that swept through America and Europe. Millions of people attended seances hoping to contact deceased relatives, and it was only decades later that the Fox sisters admitted the whole thing was a hoax created by cracking their toe joints. But by then, spiritualism had become an entire religious movement that persists to this day. You might think it is obvious that bringing back the dead is a bad idea, but the Harry Potter series actually treats this temptation with tremendous sympathy. Rowling never suggests that Harry is wrong to want his parents back, or that his grief is something to be ashamed of, and this emotional generosity makes the eventual lesson more powerful when it comes. The Resurrection Stone appears in the story gradually. First, there is the mysterious mention of the Peveril ring that Dumbledore destroyed as a Horcrux. Then, the revelation that the ring contained the Resurrection Stone. Then, the disclosure that Dumbledore put on the ring because he desperately wanted to see his dead sister and parents again. And this decision cost him his life because the ring was cursed. You realize that Dumbledore, the wisest wizard alive, fell victim to exactly the same temptation that ensnares so many others, which makes his warnings to Harry about the Hallows carry extra weight because Dumbledore is speaking from painful experience. The scholarly debate about whether Dumbledore actually saw his family when he put on the ring or whether he simply saw what he wanted to see before the curse took hold reveals how much readers care about these characters and their traumas. You follow the stone's path from Marvolo Gaunt's ring to Dumbledore's blackened hand to the golden snitch to Harry's pocket, and you notice that the stone keeps finding people who are grieving, people who are desperate enough to risk everything for one more conversation with the dead. The way Dumbledore hides the stone inside the snitch that Harry caught in his first Quidditch match is characteristically clever. Harry will not be able to open the snitch until he is truly ready to die, because the snitch opens at the touch and only responds to the first person who touches it, which in this case means it opens when Harry finally accepts that he must walk into the Forbidden Forest and let Voldemort kill him. You think about the phrase engraved on the snitch, "I open at the close," and you marvel at how Dumbledore packed so much meaning into 4 words. The snitch opens at the close of Harry's search, at the close of Harry's life, at the close of the war, all these meanings collapsing into a single moment of revelation. The historical fact that in many cultures, from ancient Greece to modern Japan, there are specific rituals and time periods associated with mourning, and violating these customs was considered dangerous because it meant refusing to let the dead go, suggests that the Resurrection Stone represents a temptation that humans have always struggled against. When Harry finally opens the snitch and uses the stone, he does not use it to bring back the dead for his own comfort. He uses it to gain the courage to die, summoning the shades of his mother, father, Sirius, and Lupin to walk with him to his death, which is a complete inversion of how Cadmus Peveril used the stone. The quirky detail here is that in some versions of fairy tales, objects must be used in ways their creators never intended in order to reveal their true purpose, which is exactly what happens with the Resurrection Stone. It was created to bring back the dead for the living, but Harry uses it to help the living join the dead, at least temporarily. You watch the scene in the forest where Harry talks to the shades, and you notice that they are not really there. They are manifestations of Harry's memory and love, echoes rather than resurrections. And they tell him that dying does not hurt, that they will be with him, that he is brave, which is everything he needs to hear, but also everything he already knew in his heart. The fact that the shades are described as part of him, more solid to him than they are to anyone else, suggests that the stone does not actually bring back the dead at all. It makes visible what is already present in the heart of the person using it, which is both more and less powerful than actual resurrection. You cannot help but think about the second brother in the tale who brought back his dead love only to find her cold and separated from him by an invisible barrier, and how this drove him to suicide. The story suggests that the returned dead do not want to be back, that they exist in a place beyond the stone's power to truly reach, and that summoning them is an act of cruelty to both the dead and the living. Harry understands this instinctively, which is why he does not keep the shades around. He lets them fade. He drops the stone in the forest, and he never tells anyone where it is because he knows the stone is too dangerous to exist in the world. The scholarly debate about whether Harry should have destroyed the stone, as Dumbledore destroyed the ring, or whether leaving it lost in the forest was sufficient, reveals different philosophies about how to handle dangerous knowledge. Some argue that destroying the stone would be hubris, erasing a piece of magical history, while others contend that leaving it where someone else might eventually find it was irresponsible. You think about all the people in the series who have lost loved ones, and how the stone could tempt them. Hermione, if she had lost her parents; Ron, if he had lost anyone in his large family; Ginny, if Harry had died permanently; and especially Neville, who visits his parents at St. Mungo's Hospital, even though they no longer recognize him because they were tortured into insanity. For Neville, the stone might offer the chance to speak to his parents as they were before Bellatrix destroyed them, which would be almost unbearably tempting, but also ultimately hollow because the shades would not be the real Frank and Alice Longbottom. The historical fact that in 1692, during the Salem witch trials, several people were executed partially because of spectral evidence, meaning testimony that the accused person's spirit or shape had appeared to the witness, shows how the human tendency to see and believe in visions of the absent can be weaponized and turn deadly. You smile grimly at the thought that the resurrection stone would probably be banned by the Ministry of Magic if anyone knew it still existed, classified as a dark object alongside Horcruxes and cursed necklaces. Though given the Ministry's track record of competence, they probably would have lost it within a week of confiscating it. The stone represents the human inability to accept loss, but it also represents love, because only people who genuinely loved those who have died would be tempted to use it. Voldemort would have no use for the Resurrection Stone, because he has never loved anyone, which is both his greatest weakness and the thing that saves him from this particular temptation. You think about how the stone is the only hollow that Harry deliberately gives up, dropping it in the forest where he was killed, letting it disappear into the moss and leaves and undergrowth where it might lie for centuries or forever. This act of renunciation is what finally makes Harry the master of death. Not in the sense of conquering death, but in the sense of accepting it, understanding it, and choosing life without clinging to what has been lost. The wisdom here is very Buddhist. Attachment to what is gone causes suffering, and release comes through acceptance, which is not a common message in children's literature, where endings are usually happy and losses are usually reversed. Rowling refuses to give Harry a magical solution to grief, and this refusal is one of the most mature elements of the series. You stand before the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand in existence, and you feel its history like a weight in the air. Every duel it has won, every wizard it has killed, every drop of blood spilled in pursuit of it. The wand is made of elder wood with a core of thestral hair, which is significant because thestrals are creatures that can only be seen by people who have witnessed death, and you realize that from the very beginning, this wand was connected to mortality and loss. According to legend, Death himself created the wand for Antioch Peverell, the eldest brother, carving it from a nearby elder tree. though Dumbledore's commentary suggests that Antioch was simply an extraordinarily talented wand-maker who created something unprecedented, and the story of death was added later to explain how a mortal could produce such power. The historical parallel is that throughout history, legendary weapons have accumulated mythical backstories. King Arthur's sword, Excalibur, was supposedly given to him by the Lady of the Lake. Roland's sword, Durendal, contained holy relics, and the sword of Gryffindor in the Harry Potter universe appears to those who are brave and worthy, all examples of how powerful objects become narrative magnets, attracting stories that enhance their significance. You trace the Elder Wand's bloody history. Antioch Peveril was murdered in his sleep for it. Then the wand passed to his killer, who was eventually defeated by another wizard, who was defeated by another, creating a chain of violence stretching across centuries. The quirky detail is that in medieval Europe, swords and other weapons were sometimes passed down through families and given individual names and histories, creating lineages of objects that paralleled family lineages, and chronicles would record the weapon's ownership and notable battles the way they recorded human genealogies, which means the Elder Wand's documented history is not as unusual as it might seem, just more magical. You might think that a wand of such power would be used for great achievements like healing plagues or building cities, but instead its history is almost entirely violent. Nearly every owner of the Elder Wand acquired it through defeating the previous owner, usually lethally, creating a pattern where possessing ultimate power makes you a target for anyone seeking ultimate power. This is the Elder Wand's curse. It cannot be owned peacefully because anyone who knows about it will want it, and anyone who wants it will be willing to kill for it, which means that every owner is marked for death from the moment they claim it. The scholarly debate about whether the Elder Wand actually is more powerful than other wands, or whether its reputation creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where wizards believe it is unbeatable and therefore fight harder to obtain it or give up faster, when facing it, reveals how much of power is psychological. You watch the wand's progress through the main series. It belonged to some unnamed wizard, then Gregorovitch the Wandmaker, then Grindelwald who stole it, then Dumbledore, who defeated Grindelwald in their legendary 1945 duel. And then things get complicated. Dumbledore's ownership of the Elder Wand is fascinating because he possessed the most powerful weapon in the wizarding world and used it primarily for teaching, for protecting his students, and for elaborate displays of magic that intimidated dark wizards into leaving Hogwarts alone. Unlike previous owners who used the wand to dominate others, Dumbledore used it to maintain peace, which suggests that power itself is neutral and its moral character depends entirely on the intentions of whoever wields it. You realize that Dumbledore's greatest fear was himself, or more specifically, his own capacity for ambition and domination, which is why he stayed at Hogwarts rather than pursuing power in the Ministry, why he refused to become Minister of Magic despite multiple offers, and why he was so careful in how he used the Elder Wand. The historical fact that in ancient Rome, successful generals returning from war were granted triumphs, elaborate parades through the city, but during the parade, a slave stood behind the general whispering, "Memento mori," remember that you are mortal. To prevent hubris, shows that humans have long understood that power is dangerous to those who possess it. The quirky detail about the Roman triumph is that the general wore a golden crown and was painted red like the statue of Jupiter, temporarily becoming almost godlike, which makes the slave's reminder of mortality both poignant and essential, much like how the Elder Wand offers godlike power while simultaneously marking its owner for death. You cannot help but laugh at the thought that if the Elder Wand were real, it would probably end up in some magical museum behind 30 layers of security charms, or possibly at the bottom of the ocean where no one could ever find it. Though knowing the wizarding world's approach to dangerous objects, they would probably just stick it in a drawer at the Ministry and forget about it until some underpaid employee accidentally used it to stir their tea. When Dumbledore dies, the wand's allegiance should pass to Snape, who killed Dumbledore, except that Dumbledore's death was planned, a suicide assisted by Snape, which complicates the wand's loyalty. The Elder Wand operates according to its own rules. It transfers allegiance when its owner is defeated, but defeated can mean different things. Being disarmed counts, being killed counts, but willingly giving up the wand or dying as planned apparently does not count. The wand's allegiance actually passed to Draco Malfoy when he disarmed Dumbledore on the Astronomy Tower, though Draco did not know this and never even touched the Elder Wand, which means you can be the master of the Elder Wand without possessing it, a detail that will become crucial at the end of the series. You watch Voldemort's quest for the Elder Wand, and you see how his obsession with power makes him simultaneously brilliant and blind. He correctly identifies the wand as a weapon that could make him invincible. He correctly traces its history from Gregorovitch to Grindelwald to Dumbledore, but he fundamentally misunderstands what it means to defeat someone because Voldemort thinks only in terms of killing. When Voldemort concludes that Snape must be the wand's master because Snape killed Dumbledore and therefore he must kill Snape to become the master, you see the tragic irony that Voldemort's narrow definition of victory leads him to murder one of his most loyal followers for no reason. The scholarly debate about whether the Elder Wand is conscious in any meaningful sense, whether it chooses its master or simply responds mechanically to magical laws about defeat and allegiance, touches on questions of agency and consciousness that philosophers have debated for millennia. You think about the final duel between Harry and Voldemort and how the entire outcome hinges on wand lore. Harry is the true master of the Elder Wand because he defeated Draco, who had defeated Dumbledore, and when Voldemort tries to use the Elder Wand to kill Harry, the wand refuses to harm its true master. The wand's refusal takes the form of Voldemort's killing curse, rebounding and destroying him, which means that Voldemort's pursuit of ultimate power leads directly to his death, completing the thematic arc that began with the tale of the three brothers. The historical fact that Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE by senators who feared his accumulation of power, and that the assassins believed they were saving the Roman Republic, even though their actions led to years of civil war and eventually to the empire they feared, suggests that pursuing power to prevent someone else from having power often backfires spectacularly. After the battle, Harry does something that no previous owner of the Elder Wand has ever done. He chooses to give it up. He uses it only once more to repair his original wand, and then he plans to return the Elder Wand to Dumbledore's tomb so that its power will die with him when he eventually dies undefeated. This decision is remarkable because Harry is effectively giving up the most powerful weapon in existence, choosing to make himself vulnerable, trusting that he will not need ultimate power to live a good life. The scholarly debate about whether Harry should have destroyed the Elder Wand rather than returning it to the tomb centers on whether it is more arrogant to destroy a historical artifact or to assume that you will remain undefeated for the rest of your life. You smile at the thought that, in the movies, Harry dramatically snaps the Elder Wand and throws it off a bridge, which is visually satisfying but completely contradicts the book where he carefully repairs his own wand first, showing that Harry values sentimental objects over powerful ones. The Elder Wand represents the temptation of domination, the seductive idea that if you are powerful enough, you can solve all problems through force, protect everyone you love through strength, and never have to compromise or negotiate or accept limitations. This is Voldemort's entire philosophy distilled into an object, and the fact that pursuing this philosophy leads to his destruction, while Harry's rejection of it leads to his survival, suggests Rowling's firm stance on what constitutes true strength. You think about how many fantasy stories would end with the hero keeping the ultimate weapon, using it for good, establishing a peaceful kingdom through superior force. But Rowling refuses this ending because she understands that power corrupts and that the cycle of violence only ends when someone chooses not to dominate. The Elder Wand is more than a weapon. It is a test of character, and nearly everyone who has ever possessed it has failed that test by using it for conquest or keeping it for security, and only Harry passes by giving it away. You see the symbol of the Deathly Hallows appearing in places it should not be, carved into stone walls and worn as jewelry and scratched onto parchment, and you realize that this simple geometric shape has become a banner for different movements, some noble and some terrible, and its meaning shifts depending on who claims it. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. The symbol appears at Florinbill's wedding worn by Xenophilius Lovegood, and Victor Crumb recognizes it and reacts with anger, because the symbol is associated with Grindelwald, the dark wizard who nearly conquered Europe in the 1940s. You learn that Grindelwald adopted the Deathly Hallows symbol as his personal mark, carving it on the walls of Durmstrang Institute when he was a student there, using it as a rallying sign for his followers who believed that wizards should rule over muggles for the greater good. The historical parallel is striking because in our world, the swastika was originally an ancient symbol used in Hinduism, Buddhism, and various Indo-European cultures to represent good fortune and prosperity. But after the Nazi Party adopted it in the 1920s, it became so associated with genocide and hatred that its original meanings were effectively erased in Western consciousness, showing how powerful groups can hijack symbols and transform their significance. The quirky detail is that the word swastika comes from Sanskrit svastika, meaning conducive to well-being, and the symbol can be found in archaeological sites dating back thousands of years across Asia, Europe, and even the Americas, yet now most Westerners cannot see it without thinking of Nazism, which demonstrates the power of recent history to overwrite ancient meanings. You might think the comparison between Grindelwald and Hitler is heavy-handed, but Rowling intentionally set Grindelwald's defeat in 1945, the same year World War II ended, and she has confirmed in interviews that Grindelwald represents a magical parallel to fascism, complete with concentration camps for Muggles and Muggleborns, the ideology of magical supremacy, and a charismatic leader who convinced followers that oppression was for the greater good of both the oppressed and the oppressors. You watch Xenophilius Lovegood explain the symbol to Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and you see how the same shape carries completely different connotations depending on the viewer. To Xenophilius, it represents a mystical quest for magical mastery over death. To Victor Crumb, it represents dark magic and the murder of his grandfather. And to Hermione, it represents a dangerous distraction from the real work of destroying Horcruxes. This multiplicity of meaning is what makes symbols powerful and dangerous. They can unite people around a common cause, but they can also divide people when different groups claim the same symbol means opposite things. The scholarly debate about whether Grindelwald genuinely believed in the Deathly Hallows or simply used the symbol as propaganda to recruit followers touches on questions about the relationship between sincere belief and cynical manipulation that plague discussions of historical demagogues. You follow the thread of Grindelwald's relationship with Dumbledore, and you discover one of the most painful backstories in the series. Young Dumbledore, brilliant and ambitious, met young Grindelwald when Grindelwald was hiding with his great-aunt in Godric's Hollow, and the two became friends. Possibly more than friends, united by their shared intellectual brilliance and their conviction that the Deathly Hallows were real and could be found. Together, they planned a revolution where wizards would emerge from hiding, claim the Hallows, and establish a new world order with wizards ruling for the greater good, a phrase that would haunt Dumbledore for the rest of his life. The quirky detail that Godric's Hollow, the village where this happened, is also where Harry's parents died years later, suggests that certain places attract significant magical events, though it might just be that Rowling wanted to consolidate locations to make the geography more manageable, which is fair enough given how many locations the series already has. You cannot help but laugh darkly at the thought that Dumbledore spent his youth planning magical fascism and his adulthood fighting it, which is quite the character arc and suggests that Rowling believes people are capable of learning from their mistakes, even catastrophic ones. The partnership between Dumbledore and Grindelwald ended when Dumbledore's brother Aberforth objected to their plans. A duel broke out between the three of them, and in the chaos, Dumbledore's sister Ariana was killed by a stray curse, though no one knows whose curse actually killed her. This moment shattered Dumbledore, ended his friendship with Grindelwald, and transformed him from an ambitious teenager planning world domination into the cautious, guilt-ridden man who would refuse power for the rest of his life. The historical fact that many political radicals in their youth become more conservative as they age, often due to witnessing the unintended consequences of revolutionary ideologies, suggests that Dumbledore's trajectory from radical to moderate is psychologically realistic, though usually this process does not involve magical duels and dead sisters. You see how the Deathly Hallows symbol functions as Grindelwald's brand. It is simple enough to reproduce easily, distinctive enough to recognize instantly, and mysterious enough to intrigue potential recruits who want to be part of something ancient and powerful. This is Marketing 101, though usually marketing professors do not discuss how to brand your magical supremacist movement, at least not in the classes you have attended. Grindelwald's use of the symbol is particularly insidious because it takes a legend about three brothers and death and turns it into a call for domination, transforming a story about accepting mortality into a justification for imposing your will on others. You watch Victor Crumb's reaction at the wedding, and you understand that for him, seeing someone casually wear Grindelwald's symbol is like seeing someone casually wear Nazi insignia. It represents trauma, loss, and evil, and the fact that Xenophilius means no harm, that he is just an eccentric believer in fairy tales, does not change how the symbol reads to someone whose family was victimized by Grindelwald's regime. This cultural disconnect, where the same symbol means mystical quest to one person and my grandfather was murdered to another, is exactly how symbols work in the real world. They are inherently unstable, always at risk of being reinterpreted or reclaimed or weaponized by new groups with new agendas. The scholarly debate about whether it is appropriate for Harry Potter fans to use the Deathly Hallows symbol in merchandise, tattoos, and fan art given its association with Grindelwald within the fictional universe mirrors real-world debates about cultural appropriation, historical sensitivity, and the difference between fictional and real-world symbolism. You think about how Rowling navigates this problem. She has the symbol associated with evil through Grindelwald, but she also has it associated with wisdom through Dumbledore and survival through Harry, essentially reclaiming the symbol for good, or at least for ambiguity. This narrative move suggests that symbols are not permanently tainted by their misuse, that they can be recovered and given new meanings, which is a hopeful message, even if it does not entirely address the pain caused by the original misuse. The historical parallel here is how various groups have attempted to reclaim symbols or terms that were used against them, from the LGBTQ+ community reclaiming queer to disability activists reclaiming crip. Transformations that are always contested and never fully complete, but that represent an attempt to seize agency over one's own representation. The quirky detail is that in heraldry, the medieval system of designing and interpreting coats of arms, symbols that were used by one family could be modified slightly and used by a different family. But using another family's symbol without permission was a serious offense that could lead to legal disputes, which shows that fights over who has the right to use which symbols are not new. You cannot help but smile at the thought that somewhere in the Harry Potter universe, there is probably a ministry office that handles disputes about magical trademark infringement, and they definitely had a busy decade dealing with everyone who wanted to put the Deathly Hallows symbol on their business cards after Harry defeated Voldemort. When Harry sees the symbol in different contexts throughout Deathly Hallows, his understanding of it evolves. At first, it is just a curiosity. Then it becomes a key to understanding his destiny. Then it becomes associated with Dumbledore's questionable past. And finally, it becomes something he possesses without being possessed by. A symbol he has mastered by refusing to let it master him. The transformation of the Deathly Hallows symbol from Grindelwald's mark to Harry's legacy represents a hope that even symbols associated with darkness can be redeemed through the actions of good people, which is either inspiring or naive depending on your perspective, and probably both. You walk alongside Ignotus Peverell, the third brother, the one who chose wisely, and you try to understand what made him different from his brothers, beyond the simple fact that the story needed someone to survive to pass down the cloak. Ignotus is described in The Tale of the Three Brothers as the youngest and humblest, and these qualities save his life. When death offers him a gift, Ignotus does not ask for power over others like his eldest brother, nor does he ask for power over death itself like his second brother. But rather he asks for the power to leave that dangerous place without being followed by death. This request is fundamentally defensive rather than aggressive, focused on survival rather than domination, and it is this orientation towards self-preservation over self-aggrandizement that marks Ignotus as wise. You think about the psychological profiles of the three brothers, and you realize that Antioch is the narcissist who cannot conceive of any wizard being more powerful than himself. Cadmus is the melancholic who cannot accept loss and would rather die than live without his loved one. And Ignotus is the realist who understands that some forces cannot be defeated, and the smart response is to avoid them rather than to challenge them. The historical fact that in ancient Chinese philosophy, particularly in Taoism, the concept of wu-wei, or non-action, suggests that the wisest response to overwhelming force is often to flow around it rather than to oppose it directly, shows that Ignotus's strategy of hiding rather than fighting represents a philosophical tradition that values survival over heroism. You watch Ignotus live out his long life, hidden from death by the cloak, raising a family, passing down his gift to his son, and finally, when he is old and tired and ready, removing the cloak and greeting death as an old friend. This ending is so different from his brother's fates that it almost feels like a different genre of story. Where Antioch's tale is a tragedy of pride and Cadmus's tale is a tragedy of obsession, Ignotus's tale is simply a life well lived, followed by a death well met, which is not particularly dramatic but is deeply satisfying. The quirky detail is that in medieval literature, there was a genre called ars moriendi, or the art of dying, instructional texts that taught Christians how to die well, how to face death with courage and faith, and these texts were incredibly popular in the 14th and 15th centuries after the Black Death made mortality impossible to ignore. Ignotus's story functions as a kind of ars moriendi, teaching through example that the art of dying well begins with the art of living well, without hubris or denial, and then accepting the inevitable when it comes. You might think that Ignotus's story is less interesting than his brother's because it lacks conflict and catastrophe, but actually, the simplicity is the point. Wisdom is often boring, at least in narrative terms, because wisdom means avoiding the dramatic mistakes that make for good stories. The scholarly debate about whether Ignotus truly outsmarted death, or whether death knew all along that the cloak would lead to this outcome, effectively teaching humans the correct attitude toward mortality, reveals different interpretations of whether the tale is about human cleverness or divine pedagogy. You trace Ignotus's bloodline forward to Harry, and you see how the cloak passing through generations creates a lineage not just of wizards, but of a particular approach to magic and life. The Potters, as far as we can tell, were never dark wizards seeking ultimate power, never made Horcruxes, never tried to conquer death, but instead lived relatively normal lives, raised families, and faced dangers when necessary but did not seek them out. This is a very different magical lineage than, say, the Blacks or the Gaunts, whose family trees are full of dark wizards, pure blood mania, and cousins marrying cousins to preserve blood purity, which never ends well. The historical parallel is that in actual human genealogy, family cultures and values are transmitted across generations, not just through explicit teaching, but through modeling, through stories told and untold, through what is celebrated and what is condemned. And the Potter family seems to have transmitted a culture of courage combined with humility, which is a rare combination. You think about James Potter, Harry's father, and how he used the invisibility cloak mostly for pranks and mischief during his Hogwarts years, which suggests that he did not fully appreciate what he possessed. Or perhaps that he understood it well enough to not let it dominate his life. James lent the cloak to Dumbledore just before he was killed, ostensibly so Dumbledore could study it, but you realize that this decision saved the cloak from being seized by Voldemort when he attacked the Potter house, which means that even James's casual attitude toward the cloak ended up serving the greater good. The quirky detail is that in fairy tales and myths, magical objects often have wills of their own and arranged to be in the right place at the right time, which raises the question of whether the cloak somehow influenced James to lend it to Dumbledore, or whether this is just narrative convenience. And honestly, either explanation works within the story's logic. You cannot help but smile at the thought that the most powerful defensive magical object in existence was used by teenage boys to sneak out of their dormitory and raid the kitchen, which is both a waste of its potential and somehow exactly the right use for it because it kept them from taking it too seriously. The contrast between how different characters relate to the Deathly Hallows reveals their deepest values. Voldemort seeks the Elder Wand because he values power and domination. Dumbledore was tempted by all three Hallows because he valued knowledge and control. Grindelwald wanted them to reshape society according to his vision, but Harry ends up with all three and uses them not to dominate, but to sacrifice himself and protect others, which is very Ignotus Peverell of him. You see that the story has been building toward this thematic resolution from the beginning. Harry has been dying symbolically throughout the series, losing parts of himself, giving up pieces of his soul to protect others, learning again and again that love requires sacrifice, and the Deathly Hallows story simply makes this theme explicit by forcing Harry to literally walk to his death. When Harry walks into the Forbidden Forest in the book's climax, he is doing exactly what Ignotus did at the end of his long life, removing the cloak, facing death directly, and greeting him as an old friend. The difference is that Harry is 17, not elderly, but his willingness to die young rather than let others die for him represents the same wisdom that Ignotus demonstrated by living quietly and well until the time came to go. The scholarly debate about whether Harry is truly the Master of Death because he possessed all three Hallows, or because he was willing to die centers on whether mastery of death means conquering it or accepting it, and Rowling clearly believes it is the latter. You think about the historical fact that in many warrior cultures, from Spartan Greece to feudal Japan, there were elaborate codes about how to face death with honor, and warriors were expected to contemplate their mortality regularly so that they would not be caught off guard when the moment came, which suggests that humans have always understood that preparing to die well is part of living well. The teaching of the Tale of the Three Brothers, transmitted through the Tales of Beedle the Bard, and ultimately to Harry through Hermione's inheritance from Dumbledore, is that death is not an enemy to be defeated, but a natural process to be accepted, and that the greatest magic is not the power to kill or resurrect, but the wisdom to know when to fight and when to yield. This is not the message you would expect from a 7-book series about a boy fighting an evil wizard, which makes it all the more powerful when it arrives. Rowling spends 6.5 books training readers to think in terms of battles and victories, and then in the final chapter she reveals that the real victory is accepting defeat, that the real power is surrendering power, that the real magic is loving enough to die. Ignotus Peveril, a character who appears only briefly in a fairy tale told in the 7th book, becomes the thematic North Star of the entire series, the example that Harry ultimately follows, the wise choice that saves everyone. You stand at the end of the journey, the Deathly Hallows revealed and examined and understood, and you realize that the greatest symbol in the Harry Potter series was never really about magical objects at all, but about 3 ways of responding to mortality and the wisdom to choose the hardest path. The triangle, circle, and line have become separated in your mind into distinct philosophies. Fight death with power, deny death with resurrection, or accept death with grace. And you have watched Harry Potter work through each option until he arrives at acceptance. The symbol that seemed so mysterious when you first saw it scratched on a wall or worn as a pendant now feels almost transparent. Of course, it represents the 3 Hallows. Of course, the 3 Hallows represent 3 approaches to death. Of course, Harry had to possess all 3 to understand that possessing them meant nothing compared to using them wisely. You walk through memory of the series, and you notice how Rowling planted seeds of this theme from the very beginning. The Mirror of Erised in the 1st book, which shows the deepest desire of whoever looks into it and nearly traps Harry in fruitless longing for his dead parents, is essentially a version of the Resurrection Stone, offering visions of the dead that are not truly there. The Philosopher's Stone in the same book offers eternal life, but Nicolas Flamel chooses to destroy it and die, demonstrating the wisdom of accepting mortality centuries before Harry learns the same lesson. Voldemort creates Horcruxes to avoid death, becoming the ultimate negative example of the second brother's refusal to accept loss, and his immortality is so diminished, so fragmentary and painful that it becomes worse than death. The historical fact that ancient Greek mythology includes the story of Tithonus, who was granted immortality but not eternal youth and so aged forever, becoming increasingly decrepit but unable to die until he was eventually transformed into a grasshopper, shows that stories about the horror of immortality are ancient. Humans have long understood that death gives meaning to life, and life without death would be not paradise but torture. You think about all the deaths in the Harry Potter series, and you realize that each one teaches Harry something about mortality. Quirrell's death shows that evil destroys itself. Cedric's death shows that death can be random and meaningless. Sirius's death shows that love does not protect you from loss. Dumbledore's death shows that even the wise must die. And finally, Harry's own temporary death shows that accepting death is the path to defeating it. The quirky detail is that in many religious traditions, from Christianity to Buddhism to ancient Egyptian religion, death is not truly an ending, but a transformation, a passage to another state of being, and Harry's experience of dying and then returning suggests that Rowling is working within this tradition, even while writing a story about wizards and wands. The Deathly Hallows symbol has traveled far beyond the pages of the books. You see it tattooed on arms, hanging from necklaces, painted on walls, incorporated into wedding ceremonies where couples promise to greet death together as old friends after a long life. The symbol has become shorthand for a particular kind of wisdom, the understanding that life is precious because it ends, that love is powerful because it persists beyond death, that the only way to truly defeat death is to stop trying to defeat it. This transformation of a fictional symbol into a real cultural touchstone is rare. Most fictional symbols stay safely inside their stories, but a few break through and become part of how people actually understand their lives. And the Deathly Hallows symbol has done this for millions of readers who found in it a vocabulary for discussing mortality that their own cultures did not provide. You walk through the debates that still continue about the series, about whether the Hallows or the Horcruxes are more important, about whether Harry's sacrifice was necessary or manipulated by Dumbledore, about whether the epilogue should have been different, and you realize that these debates are themselves a tribute to how thoroughly Rowling embedded death and choice and love into every layer of her narrative. The scholarly work continues, dissertations are written, conferences are held, and people who grew up with Harry Potter are now teaching their own children about the boy who lived and the man who chose to die, passing down not just a story but a framework for thinking about courage and sacrifice and the hard wisdom of acceptance. The historical parallel is that fairy tales have always functioned this way, containing within their simple structures complex lessons about how to live and how to die. And Harry Potter is simply a very long fairy tale with wands instead of magic beans, and Voldemort instead of a giant. But the fundamental structure is the same. You cannot help but think about the readers who have found comfort in the Deathly Hallows story during their own encounters with grief and loss, the people who have reported reading the chapter where Harry walks into the Forbidden Forest with his summoned dead around him, and finding in it permission to grieve, permission to be afraid, permission to keep going anyway. This is what stories do at their best. They give us maps for emotional territories we have not yet entered. They show us how others have navigated pain and fear. They promise us that we are not alone in our mortality. The Deathly Hallows symbol, simple as it is, carries all of this weight, and you understand now why people treasure it, why they wear it, why they pass it on to their children, not as a mark of fandom, but as a reminder of something true. You think about Ignotus Peverell one last time, the third brother who chose the cloak, who lived quietly and well, who raised his family and grew old, and then, when the time came, removed his protection and went willingly with death. This is the ending we all hope for, is it not? Not to live forever, not to bring back those we have lost, not to dominate others with our power, but simply to live well and then die well, surrounded, if we are lucky, by people we love. Ready, if we are wise, to take the next step into the unknown. Harry Potter learns this lesson at 17, which seems young, but perhaps it is never too young to understand that death is not the enemy, that fear of death is what makes us cruel and small, that accepting death is what allows us to live fully. The wind is rising now, soft and cool, and you feel it moving through the imaginary forest where you have been walking, rustling the leaves overhead and carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things. The light is fading, not dramatically, but gradually, the way light actually fades at the end of a long day, and you realize that you are tired, that this journey through symbols and stories and deaths has taken something from you, even as it has given you something valuable. You think about what it means to greet death as an old friend, and you understand that friendship requires familiarity, requires spending time together, requires learning each other's ways, which means that thinking about death is not morbid but necessary, not depressing but clarifying. The Deathly Hallows have taught you this, or rather, they have taught Harry this, and you have been watching. And now, as the story winds down and the forest grows darker and quieter, you feel ready to carry this lesson with you, to remember that the triangle and the circle and the line are not just shapes on a page, but invitations to wisdom. You see Harry one last time in your mind, 19 years later, in the epilogue, sending his own children off to Hogwarts, and you realize that he has done what Ignotus did. He lived through the danger, he raised a family, he grew older though not yet old, and someday, when his time comes, he will remove the metaphorical cloak and face what comes next with courage, because he has already done it once and knows that love persists beyond death, that death is not the end of the story, but part of it, that the symbol he carries in his heart is not about cheating mortality, but about accepting it fully. The forest is very dark now and very quiet, and you find a soft place beneath an old tree where the moss has grown thick and comfortable, and you settle there, your back against the rough bark, your eyes closing slowly as the last light filters through the branches above. You think about stories and symbols and the strange magic of words that can make fictional deaths feel real and real deaths feel bearable. And you understand that this is the true magic, not spells or wands or even invisibility cloaks, but the ability of stories to change how we see the world and ourselves. The Deathly Hallows symbol glows faintly in your mind, triangle and circle and line, and as you drift towards sleep, you realize that you have been holding all three hallows all along. The power to fight, the wand, the temptation to deny loss, the stone, and the wisdom to survive, the cloak. And like Harry, you must choose which to master and which to release. Your breathing slows, deep and even, and the forest breathes with you. The ancient trees, and the quiet earth, and the patient darkness that is not empty, but full of rest, full of dreams, full of the peace that comes when you stop running and simply let yourself be held by the night. The symbol fades, or perhaps you fade, the boundaries between story and sleep becoming soft and permeable, and you know without knowing how you know that the tale has been told, the lessons have been learned, the three brothers have made their choices, and you have witnessed them all. The last thought before sleep takes you completely is that you will remember this. Remember the triangle and the circle and the line. Remember that death is not an enemy but a friend you have not met yet. Remember that the greatest magic is simply love and acceptance, and the courage to keep living until the time comes to stop. And then, with that thought still warm in your mind like a candle flame cupped in gentle hands, you let go, you drift, you sleep, and the forest keeps its silent vigil around you. And somewhere far away, a boy who lived has become a man who understood, and his children are sleeping too, and their children will sleep someday. And the story goes on, quiet and true and eternal, as the symbol itself, triangle and circle and line, forever.